and real results. The defendant took the stand today and told you how she's the producer, the director, and the star of her film Dust. But members of the jury, this Western may have been a fiction, but what's real is that the defendant was the reckless shooter on October 21st and still is today. We are the prosecution and we have the burden in today's case. And that burden is to prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jeff Brooks, the defendant, committed an act that might produce death, which it did. 2, that the defendant acted with gross negligence. And 3, that the defendant's act was the proximate cause of the death of the victim, Paul Parisi. 4, that the killing was unlawful. And 5, that the killing occurred on federal property. These are the 5 elements we had to prove to you today. And it is undisputed between both us and the defense that we have met elements 4 and elements 5. All we had to prove to you today were elements 1 through 3. That Jeff Brooks committed an act that might produce death, that Jeff Brooks acted with gross negligence, and that Jeff Brooks' act was the proximate cause of the death of Paul Parisi. Let's walk through these elements. Number 1, we know that Ms. Brooks committed an act that might produce death, and that's because it did. But let's take a step back and talk about what that act was. We know her fingerprint was on the trigger of the gun that killed Paul Parisi. But let's talk about how that real gun even got on set. Why those bullets are inside that gun. That real gun was on set because Jeff Brooks demanded realism and demanded to have a real gun on set. It was loaded with the real bullets that Ms. Brooks specifically instructed Ms. Tobin to put in that gun. This is the gun that killed Paul Parisi, and it is no question that Ms. Brooks had that gun in her hand when it went off after pulling the trigger and killing Paul Parisi. That's element number 1. Element number 2, that Ms. Brooks acted with gross negligence. But what is gross negligence? This is purposeful conduct to cause harm. Purposeful. A display of reckless disregard for the value of human life. And it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's purposeful and deliberate. Let's talk about how Ms. Brooks deliberately dismissed the value of human life. Someone who values human life treats guns with care. Someone who values human life tells people on set when there's a real gun on set, when a real gun is going to be fired. Someone who values human life isn't out drinking margaritas until 3:30 in the morning the night before a 5 a.m. set. That's someone who values human life. That is not who the defendant is. The defense wants you to believe that the defendant is someone who values human life, that she is someone who's an advocate for safety. Members of the jury, someone who's an advocate for safety and values human life is never going to pull the trigger of a gun on an assumption. On a hope. Hoping that that gun is fake. Hoping that that gun can't kill anyone, can't hurt anyone, can't fire. The defendant used it anyway. Cocked the hammer and pulled the trigger anyway. On an assumption. The defendant risked the lives of her cast and crew on an assumption, not a fact. Someone who values human life is taking the extra step, taking the extra precautions, taking measures to ensure safety, and the defendant did none. That's the second element. Now the third element is that the defendant's act of cocking the hammer, pulling the trigger, and doing so knowing it was dangerous, this led to the death of Paul Parisi. And the death of Paul Parisi is what we're here for today. He was 42 years old and leaves behind 2 children that now won't have a father. There was only one person who took the stand today who told you otherwise, who told you that Ms. Brooks didn't pull the trigger, that Ms. Brooks didn't cock the hammer. Mr. Navarro told you he didn't see Ms. Brooks do any of that. Mr. Navarro also told you that his eyes were closed while all of this was happening. Mr. Navarro did not see Miss Brooks cock the hammer or pull the trigger, not because it didn't happen, but because his eyes were closed, as called for by the script that he was following to a T. But let's talk more about that script and about when the gun went off. The gun went off at the exact time that the script called for it. And that's the proximate cause right there. The defense needs you to believe that the defendant is 1 in 100,000. Those are the odds that this gun misfired. 1 in 100,000. You're more likely to be struck by lightning, find a 4-leaf clover, win the lottery. There's a lot of things that you can do before this gun was ever going to fire. Misfire. But the defense doesn't need you only to believe that. They also need you to believe that this 1 in 100,000 chance happened at the exact moment the script called for it. Not a second later, right on schedule. Members of the jury, these odds don't add up. This story doesn't make sense. There was one person who was holding that gun. There's one person whose fingerprints are on the trigger. There was one scene that called for this gun, and there was one person who gave Miss Tobin the instructions to load it with live ammo. Let's do the math. There's only one person who's responsible for the death of Paul Parisi. And that person is Miss Jep Brooks. Her act was the proximate cause of Mr. Parisi's death, and that act was done with gross negligence, as she displayed little to no value for human life. And we know that Miss Brooks committed an act that might produce death because we don't have to look at this might with questions. We know it produced death because it did, and that's why we're here today. We as the prosecution have met this burden, all 5 elements, because as a reminder, those last 2 have already been stipulated between us and the defense. Find Jep Brooks guilty of involuntary manslaughter.